We don't buy people, Lena. We just solve problems. And right now, you are a 25 million euro problem. Victor Hale's voice was as cold as the freezing Zurich lake outside the towering glass walls of the dining room. He didn't just slide the thick manila envelope across the polished marble table, he slapped his palm down on it. The sharp smack echoed in the massive room, cutting through the heavy silence. The atmosphere in the room felt less like a family dinner and more like a military interrogation. I know what a hostile interrogation feels like. I spent years dealing with them. I looked at the envelope, then slowly up at Victor. The CEO of Hale Dominion, one of the most powerful energy conglomerates in Europe, sat perfectly straight in his bespoke tailored suit. Next to him was Eleanor, his wife, the ruthless matriarch who controlled the family's public image with an iron grip. She was taking a slow sip of her sparkling water, her face a carefully constructed mask of polite disdain. And then there was Adrian, my husband. Adrian, a senior corporate lawyer who routinely commanded courtrooms and boardrooms with effortless, aggressive charisma, couldn't even bring himself to look at me. He was staring intensely at his untouched plate of wild salmon. His hands, resting on his lap beneath the table, were shaking slightly. That tiny, pathetic tremor told me everything I needed to know. He was completely in on this. He had agreed to throw me away. "Open it," Eleanor suggested, her voice smooth but laced with undeniable venom. "It is a very generous offer. Far more than someone of your background could ever hope to see in a lifetime." I didn't reach for the envelope right away. I let the silence stretch out, letting them sit in their own arrogance. I am 38 years old. Before this marriage, I served as a logistics officer for NATO Special Operations. I have coordinated massive supply drops in active war zones in Eastern Europe while artillery shells leveled buildings just a few miles from my position. I've dealt directly with ruthless warlords, corrupt government officials, and desperate smugglers to get the job done. I still wake up sometimes with the phantom sounds of sirens in my ears, a mild case of PTSD that I keep quietly to myself. The Hales, with their private security guards standing like stone statues by the heavy oak doors and their silent, perfectly postured butler waiting in the corner, actually thought they were intimidating me. They had absolutely no idea who was sitting at their table. 25 million euros, Victor stated loudly, leaning back in his chair and tenting his fingers. Tax-free. Transferred to an offshore account of your choosing by tomorrow morning. Inside that envelope is a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. It stipulates that you will disappear from Adrian's life completely. You will file for a quiet, uncontested divorce. You will leave Zurich immediately. And there is a strict 20-year gag order. You will never speak of this family, this marriage, or this company to the press, to your friends, or to anyone ever again. I finally reached out and pulled the heavy envelope closer to me. I opened the flap and pulled out the crisp, thick legal documents. The numbers were printed boldly on the first page. Euro 25, 000, 000. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the marble. A woman like you, how could you possibly walk into this family without an ulterior motive? We had you investigated, Lena. Extensively. Our security team dug deep into your past life in Brussels, your little apartment near the military base. They found absolutely nothing of value. No hidden assets, no powerful connections, no significant family wealth. You are a nobody, which only makes us more suspicious of you. People with nothing always want something. I scanned the first page of the contract. The legal jargon was incredibly tight, meticulously designed by someone like Adrian to strip me of any possible rights to his future earnings or the vast Hale estate. I looked at Adrian again. You agree with this? I asked him directly. My voice was completely calm. Too calm. Adrian swallowed hard. He finally lifted his head, but his eyes darted away from mine almost immediately, unable to hold my gaze. He gave a single, slight nod. He didn't even have the courage to say the words out loud to my face. That cowardly nod was a knife twisting deep in my gut. After 3 years of marriage, this was how it ended. He agrees, Victor said impatiently, waving his hand. Adrian realizes now that this marriage was a terrible mistake. You don't fit in our world, Lena. You never will. Take the money. Start a new life somewhere far away. It's the best outcome for everyone involved. I carefully placed the documents back onto the marble table, aligning the edges perfectly. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. The trauma and training for my deployments had taught me how to compartmentalize sudden panic and channel it into sharp, cold, calculating focus. I looked closely at the three of them. They honestly thought they were the apex predators in the room. They thought they were buying off a poor, desperate ex-soldier. They thought they were buying me. In reality, they were insulting the most powerful person in the room. They didn't know the truth about my father. They didn't know that Magnus Voss, the man who lived quietly in a simple wooden cabin in the Austrian Alps, the man who wore faded flannel shirts and drove a battered 10-year-old truck, was a massive shadow investor. They didn't know that 20 years ago, he had quietly bought up massive chunks of failing European energy companies to save them from bankruptcy, including theirs. My father controls $12.4 billion in Hale Dominion stock. He is their largest silent shareholder. I looked right into Victor's eyes, holding his gaze until he finally blinked. I will not accept this money, I said, my voice steady and quiet. But I will remember that number. I stood up, pushing my heavy dining chair back. The harsh scrape of the wood against the floor was painfully loud. Don't be foolish, Lena, Eleanor snapped, her polite societal mask finally slipping to reveal pure, ugly arrogance. If you walk out that door without signing, you get absolutely nothing. Our lawyers will drag you through the mud in court. You'll leave with only the clothes on your back. I came into this marriage with my own clothes, I replied flatly. I'll leave with them. I turned around and walked out of the glass dining room. I didn't look back at Adrian. I walked past the silent security guards, out the heavy front doors of the ultra-luxury villa, and stepped into the crisp, freezing Zurich night. As I walked down the long, winding driveway, my mind drifted back to Brussels. Before I met Adrian, my life had been wonderfully simple, despite the intense chaos of my job. My apartment in Brussels was exactly 45 square meters. It had a leaky faucet that I fixed myself, and walls thin enough to hear the neighbor's alarm clock. But it was mine. I had built a life there based entirely on merit, not inheritance. My team relied on me to get ammunition, medical supplies, and basic rations into places where the roads were completely destroyed and the airspace was highly contested. I lived on adrenaline, black coffee, and a sense of purpose. My father, Magnus, had raised me with a very specific, grounded mindset. Even though I knew he was absurdly wealthy, we never lived like it. Money is a tool, Lena, he used to tell me, sitting on the porch of his Austrian cabin, whittling a piece of pine wood with a pocket knife. It builds bridges, it buys food, it solves mechanical problems. But the moment you use it to measure the worth of a human being, you have become the poorest person on earth. I pulled my wool coat tighter against the biting wind. The Hales had just measured my worth at 25 million euros. They thought it was a life-changing fortune. To my father, it was a rounding error on a quarterly statement. I pulled out my phone as I reached the main road. It was late, but I knew he would be awake reading. I dialed the secure, encrypted number I hadn't used for anything other than casual happy check-ins for the last 3 years. IT rang exactly twice. Lena, my bear. His deep, gruff voice answered warmly. Dad, I said, the cold air stinging my cheeks. I'm leaving Zurich. I'm coming to see you. There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. He heard the immediate shift in my tone. The sharp, military edge was back in my voice. Is it the Hales? He asked, his tone dropping an octave. Yes. Do you want me to destroy them? He asked calmly, as if he were simply offering to make me a cup of tea. Not yet, I said, watching a car pass by in the dark. But they just tried to buy me out of Adrian's life. They offered 25 million. A low, dark chuckle rumbled through the phone speaker. 25 million? They really are cheap, aren't they? The snow was coming down hard in Prague that day, completely blanketing the historic streets and making the cobblestones dangerously slick. It was late November, exactly 3.5 years ago. I had just wrapped up a brutal, highly classified logistics extraction operation near the eastern border. My body was running on pure adrenaline and whatever cheap caffeine I could find. I hadn't slept properly in 48 hours, my boots were soaked through with freezing slush, and I just wanted to sit somewhere warm where nobody would shoot at me or ask me for a supply manifest. I ducked into a tiny, poorly lit cafe right near the Charles Bridge, shaking the snow off my jacket. I ordered a simple black coffee, found a cramped table in the back corner, and just stared out the fogged-up window, trying to let the tension drain out of my shoulders. Then, the bell above the door chimed, and Adrian walked in. He looked like he had just stepped off a private jet and directly onto the cover of a high-end financial magazine. He was wearing a dark, meticulously tailored suit and a heavy cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than my entire annual military salary. He was in Prague to close a massive, multi-billion-euro mergers and acquisitions deal for his family's corporate empire. He looked entirely out of place in this dingy, rustic little coffee shop. The place was absolutely packed with locals and tourists hiding from the sudden snowstorm, and there was only one empty chair left in the entire building. It was right across from me. He walked over, gave me a polite but distinctly entitled smile, and asked if he could sit. I just nodded and went back to my coffee. He sat down, carefully brushing a speck of invisible dust off his sleeve, and immediately tried to strike up a conversation. He did that specific thing that immensely wealthy men do when they want to impress a woman. He didn't brag outright, but he casually dropped heavy hints about his status. He complained about his suite at the Four Seasons, sighed about the endless board meetings he was running, and mentioned the heavy burden of handling billions of euros in corporate assets. He expected me to widen my eyes. He expected me to ask him eager questions. He expected me to be thoroughly impressed by his sheer existence. I honestly could not have cared less. I had just spent 2 days coordinating the safe movement of medical supplies through a hostile zone. A corporate merger sounded to me like two children arguing over a sandbox. I sipped my black coffee, gave him flat, neutral responses, and treated him exactly the same way I would treat a rookie private in the motor pool. I wasn't rude, but I offered him zero validation. That was exactly what hooked him. He actually leaned across the small wooden table, staring at me as if I were some fascinating, newly discovered species. I remember the exact words he said, leaning in close so I could smell his expensive cologne over the scent of roasted beans. "You are not like the people I usually meet," he said, his voice dropping to a smooth, intimate register. The time in that snowy cafe, I thought it was a genuine compliment. I thought he was exhausted by the shallow, status-obsessed socialites in his wealthy circle. I thought he appreciated my grounded, practical nature. But looking back now, after everything that just happened at that marble dining table in Zurich, I realized the cold, hard truth. He didn't love my independence. He liked me because he thought I was beneath him. He was drawn to my modest lifestyle, my simple clothes, and my completely unglamorous military job because it made him feel incredibly powerful. To a man like Adrian Hale, I wasn't an equal partner. I was a rescue project. He loved the intoxicating feeling of being the absolute center of my financial and social universe. He liked the feeling of being superior, of being above me. We dated, and it was an absolute whirlwind of wealth and privilege. He flew me to Paris for dinner, to Milan for shopping, to Tokyo for weekend getaways. He overwhelmed me with a level of luxury I had never seen, let alone asked for. I went along with it because I genuinely thought we were building a real connection. When he proposed to me a few months later, I said yes because I loved the man I thought he was. We got married, and that was exactly when the slow, quiet suffocation began. The 3 years of our marriage were a masterclass in subtle manipulation and systemic control. It was never violent, and he never yelled. The control was always packaged as care and affection. "Let me handle the bills, Lena," he would say smoothly, physically taking the envelopes out of my hands. You don't need to worry your head about the finances. I want you to relax. He set up all the bank accounts. He gave me a platinum credit card linked directly to his primary account, effectively tracking every single cent I spent. Whenever I tried to use my own savings from my years of military pay, he would get visibly irritated and offended, acting as if my desire for financial autonomy was an insult to his ability to provide. He slowly took over every major decision in our lives. He decided where we lived, where we vacationed, what kind of car I drove, and which of his wealthy friends we had over for dinner. Over the course of 3 years, I was systematically reduced from a highly capable military logistics officer who moved tons of equipment across war zones into a simple wife whose only real job was to look elegant at corporate galas and never voice a controversial opinion in public. And then there was his family. Victor and Eleanor Hale hated me from the very first second I stepped into their Zurich estate. They looked at me like I was a piece of trash that had blown in off the street and stuck to their pristine Persian rug. They simply could not understand why the brilliant heir to the Hale dominion would choose to marry a woman with absolutely no pedigree, no trust fund, and zero social standing. So, they did exactly what paranoid billionaires do. They hired professionals to dig into my life. I found out later that Eleanor had ordered a brutally comprehensive background check on me before the wedding. They hired elite private investigators to tear my past apart. They looked for massive hidden debts, secret children, criminal records, or embarrassing scandals. They dug deep into my simple life in Brussels. They combed through my military records as much as they legally could without triggering government alarms. They found absolutely nothing. I had no debt. I had a perfectly clean record. I lived well within my modest means. I had a few close friends from my unit, and a father who lived quietly off the grid in a wooden cabin in the Austrian Alps. To a normal family, a perfectly clean background check would be a massive relief. But to the Hales, it was the ultimate red flag. In their paranoid, wealth-obsessed minds, nobody in the world is that clean. If you have nothing on paper, it means you are actively hiding something. It means you are a master manipulator playing a very long, very dangerous game. The fact that they couldn't find any dirt on me only made them wildly more suspicious. They became utterly convinced that I was a high-level grifter who had somehow brainwashed their son just to get my hands on the Hale family fortune. Their suspicion festered and grew over our 3 years of marriage. Every single time I declined an expensive gift from Eleanor, she thought it was a calculated, manipulative move to appear humble. Every time I preferred a quiet night at home over attending a flashy, high-society charity event, Victor thought I was secretly plotting against them. They never once bothered to actually get to know me. They never asked about my deployments, or the shrapnel scar on my left shoulder, or why loud, sudden noises sometimes made my heart race. They only ever saw me as a massive financial liability. I was a problem that needed to be solved. Which brought us directly to tonight. The hostile interrogation. The €25 million offer. The airtight non-disclosure agreement. And the cowardly, silent nod of agreement from the man I had married. My taxi finally pulled up to the curb outside the Zurich airport terminal. I paid the driver with the emergency cash I always kept tucked in my travel bag, a hard habit to break from my deployment days. I grabbed my single, battered duffel bag. I hadn't packed a single piece of the expensive designer clothing Adrian had bought me over the last 3 years. I was wearing my old, broken-in leather boots, a pair of durable jeans, and a thick, practical sweater. I was wearing exactly what I came into this family with. I walked into the brightly lit terminal and checked the massive digital departure board. I had a few hours to kill before the first morning flight to Innsbruck. I found a quiet corner in a 24-hour coffee shop, ordered a black coffee, and sat down. It felt exactly like that day in Prague. Except this time, I wasn't waiting out a winter snowstorm. I was waiting to start a war. I took out my phone and looked at the screen. The Hales honestly thought they were dealing with an orphaned, desperate stray. They had absolutely no idea that they had just threatened the daughter of the apex predator in their own financial ecosystem. And my father was waiting for me. The first few months in Zurich felt like an extended vacation, but the reality of my new life quickly set in. The 3 years of our marriage were supposed to be a time of building a life together, but instead, it became a period of false peace. When you are deployed in a combat zone, the threats are obvious and you know exactly where the danger is coming from. But in the pristine, aggressively controlled environment of the Hale family's Zurich estate, the hostility was entirely hidden behind polite, condescending smiles. Adrian gradually began to control every aspect of our finances. At first, he framed it as a favor to me, telling me I had worked hard enough in the military and that it was his turn to take care of everything. I let him set up the accounts, thinking this was just how civilian marriages worked when one partner was heavily involved in corporate law. But it didn't stop at paying the utility bills. He started making every single decision for me, effectively stripping away my independence. If I mentioned I needed a new winter coat, a €2,000 designer jacket would appear in my closet the next day, chosen by his personal shopper. If I suggested we go to a simple bistro for dinner, he would override my choice and book a private table at a high-end restaurant where the waiters knew his name and I just sat there quietly. I was slowly being erased. I went from being a woman who could coordinate complex supply drops under extreme pressure to someone who was treated like a simple wife. My only apparent job was to stand next to him at corporate galas, smile for the cameras, and never say anything that might distract from his rising status at Hale Dominion. When I tried to push back, or when I tried to use my own savings to buy my own things, he would get a tight, patronizing look on his face. He made me feel like my desire for basic financial autonomy was a direct insult to his ability to provide for me. I remember trying to organize a simple weekend trip for just the two of us, a chance to get away from his demanding schedule. I researched a small, quiet cabin in the Swiss Alps, something that reminded me of my father's place. I presented the idea to Adrian, genuinely excited. He looked at the printed itinerary, laughed softly, and patted my hand. He told me it was a nice thought, but he had already arranged for us to spend the weekend on a client's yacht in Monaco. My attempt at making a decision was instantly shut down by his need to maintain his corporate image. It was in those daily, dismissive moments that I realized the truth. He didn't want a partner. He wanted to insert me into his pre-existing, perfectly curated life, strictly on his terms. But Adrian's suffocating control was nothing compared to the underlying conflict with his family. Victor and Eleanor Hale never accepted me into their circle. To them, the Hale name was a royal dynasty, and I was an outsider who did not belong. I learned later just how far their paranoia actually went. The Hale family had ordered a massive, invasive investigation into my past, fully expecting to uncover a trail of debt, criminal activity, or some scandalous secret, but they found absolutely nothing. My life in Brussels had been completely clean, simple, and focused entirely on my military career. To a normal family, a clean background check would be a massive relief. To the Hales, it was a major problem. Because my record was perfectly clean, it only made them far more suspicious of my true intentions. In their corporate world, everyone had hidden leverage or dark secrets. The fact that I had no obvious vulnerabilities meant, to their paranoid minds, that I was a master manipulator. They became completely convinced I was playing a deep, calculated game to steal their son's inheritance. This suspicion dictated every single interaction I had with my mother-in-law. Dinners at the main Hale estate were never just family meals. They were hostile environments where the tension felt exactly like an interrogation room. Eleanor never yelled, but she used her soft, cultured voice to constantly undermine me. She would casually bring up the topic of money, asking deeply invasive questions about my former military income and what little personal assets I possessed. She would sit at the table, sipping her water, constantly pressing me on my motives for marrying her son. I remember one specific Sunday afternoon, sitting in her meticulously manicured garden. She looked at me directly and delivered a question I will never forget. "A person like you, how could you possibly step into this family without a motive?" She said it with a perfectly pleasant smile, but her eyes were cold. She honestly believed I was a highly trained opportunist looking for a payout. While Eleanor handled the direct questioning, Victor Hale treated me like a poorly performing asset in his company. He rarely spoke to me directly, preferring to talk about me to Adrian as if I weren't sitting right there in the room. He would analyze my background, questioning my motives and what actual value I brought to the Hale Dominion empire. He couldn't understand that a person's worth couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. The fact that their elite investigators found absolutely nothing of financial consequence only infuriated him more. Living in that environment was physically exhausting. Every word I said was analyzed for hidden agendas. Every piece of clothing I wore was judged as either too cheap, insulting the family image, or too expensive, proving I was only there for their money. I had zero allies in that house. Adrian, the man who was supposed to be my partner, completely abandoned me to his parents' judgment. Whenever Eleanor launched one of her verbal attacks, Adrian would suddenly look at his phone, or he would excuse himself to take a business call. He never once stood up for me. The isolation was absolute. I had left my career, my friends in Brussels, and my independence to be with him. I was living in a massive mansion in Zurich, surrounded by expensive furniture I wasn't allowed to choose, married to a man who wanted to control me rather than support me. I missed the loud engines of the transport planes. I missed the smell of engine grease and being around people who actually said what they meant, instead of wrapping their insults in high society etiquette. I spent hours walking around the lake in Zurich just to get out of the house. I would sit on a bench in the freezing cold, staring at the water, and wonder how I had ended up in this situation. I was a highly trained logistics officer who knew how to navigate dangerous territories, but I had completely failed to see the trap Adrian had set for me. I kept my father, Magnus, completely in the dark about how bad things had gotten. When I called him at his cabin in Austria, I put on a brave face. I told him about the scenery and the dinners. I didn't tell him that my husband monitored my credit card usage, or that my mother-in-law regularly accused me of being a parasite. My father had taught me to be strong and to solve my own problems. I was deeply ashamed that I had let myself become so thoroughly trapped by these people. I thought I could endure it. I thought if I just kept quiet, eventually they would get bored of trying to break me and leave me alone. I thought Adrian would eventually realize that I was a human being. But I was wrong. The Hales don't get bored. They escalate. The suffocation was only the beginning. They didn't just want me to be a quiet, compliant wife anymore. They had decided that my very presence was a problem that needed to be permanently removed. The pressure kept building, day after day, month after month, until it finally reached its breaking point. That breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening, disguised as a polite invitation for a private family dinner at the main estate. I didn't know it then, but they had already drawn up the contracts and decided my exact price tag. They were ready to formalize the end of my marriage, completely bypassing the emotional aspects and going straight to the financial transaction. They thought they had broken me down enough over the last 3 years that I would just take the envelope and disappear. They mistook my silence for surrender, not realizing that I was just waiting for the right moment to respond. The train ride from Zurich to Innsbruck took exactly 3 hours and 20 minutes. I spent the entire time staring out the window at the passing mountains, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 3 years slowly detach itself from my chest. When I finally arrived in Austria, I rented a heavily used 4-wheel drive vehicle and drove another hour up into the Alps. The roads grew narrower, the air grew significantly colder, and the dense pine forests closed in around the winding dirt path. My father's property sits right on the edge of a pristine, freezing alpine lake. There are no massive security gates, no armed guards standing like statues, and no marble driveways. It is just a large, solidly built wooden cabin that blends perfectly into the surrounding trees. Smoke was steadily rising from the stone chimney. As I pulled the truck into the gravel driveway, the front door opened. Magnus Voss stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing faded denim jeans, heavy work boots, and a thick flannel shirt over a thermal Henley. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his broad shoulders still carried the dense muscle of a man who spent his life doing physical labor by choice. If Victor Hale saw him right now, he would probably assume my father was a local lumberjack or a hired groundskeeper. He would never, in a million years, guess that the man standing on that wooden porch could buy the entire Hale estate with liquid cash and turn it into a parking lot before lunch. I walked up the steps, and my father wrapped his large arms around me. He didn't say a word at first. He just held me tight, letting me breathe in the familiar smell of wood smoke and old pine. "You're freezing, Lena," he finally said, his deep voice rumbling. "Get inside. I just made a fresh pot of coffee." The inside of the cabin was warm and incredibly simple. There was a large stone fireplace, a wall covered entirely in heavy bookshelves, and a sturdy oak dining table in the center of the room. It was the exact opposite of the sterile, glass-enclosed dining room I had walked out of the night before. I sat down at the table, wrapping my hands around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee, and I told him absolutely everything. I didn't sugarcoat any of it. I told him about the creeping financial control. I told him about Eleanor's constant, condescending interrogations. I told him about the elite private investigators they hired to dig through my military records. And finally, I told him about the €25 million offer, the strict non-disclosure agreement, and Adrian's cowardly nod of approval. My father sat across from me, listening in absolute silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't express shock. His face remained perfectly calm, but I could see the cold, calculating shift in his eyes. It was the exact same look I had seen on his face when he analyzed market crashes or geopolitical shifts that threatened his global investments. 25 million, my father repeated quietly when I finished. He took a slow sip of his coffee and set the mug down on the oak table. They put a price tag on you. And they made it cheap. They think I'm a grifter, Dad. They think I have absolutely nothing, and they honestly believe they are doing me a massive favor by paying me to disappear. My father let out a short, humorless laugh. He stood up, walked over to a heavy iron safe tucked discreetly behind his desk, and dialed in the combination. The heavy door clicked open. He pulled out a thick leather folder, walked back to the table, and dropped it right in front of me. "Open it," he said. I opened the folder. Inside were decades-old financial records, stock certificates, and heavily redacted corporate transfer documents. The logo at the top of the oldest papers was an older, slightly different version of the Hale Dominion crest. "Victor Hale is an arrogant fool," my father said, sitting back down. But his father, Arthur Hale, was even worse. 20 years ago, Arthur ran that energy company straight into the ground. They over-leveraged themselves on terrible infrastructure projects in Eastern Europe. They were bleeding cash, the banks were preparing to cut their credit lines, and bankruptcy was literally weeks away. They were finished. I looked at the documents. I saw my father's holding companies listed alongside massive capital injections. I stepped in. My father continued calmly. I bought up their toxic debt through 3 different offshore entities. I restructured their entire financial foundation. I injected enough raw capital to keep the lights on and the regulators away. In exchange, I took equity. Massive, silent equity. I didn't want a seat on their board because I despise dealing with corporate politicians. I just wanted the raw assets. Today, those holding companies control exactly $12.4 billion of Hale Dominion stock. I am their largest single shareholder, Lena. I own the ground Victor Hale walks on. I am the only reason his son even has a trust fund. I stared at the numbers on the pages. I always knew my father was incredibly wealthy, but seeing the exact, staggering leverage he held over the very people who had just tried to buy me off was surreal. "So," my father said, leaning forward and folding his hands together, "the Hales want to solve a problem. They think money is the ultimate weapon. What do you want to do, Lena? Do you want me to crush them right now? I can make 3 phone calls and trigger a massive sell-off. I can panic their board of directors by noon. I can completely ruin Victor's legacy before the market closes tomorrow." I thought about it. I thought about Eleanor's smug face and Adrian's pathetic inability to look me in the eye. I thought about the sheer arrogance of a family that believed they could simply purchase human beings and throw them away when they became inconvenient. "No," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Crushing them from a distance is too easy. It lets them play the victim. If you just crash their stock, They will blame the market. They will blame anonymous corporate raiders. They will never understand why it actually happened. My father raised an eyebrow, a slight smile forming on his lips. Then what is the objective? We don't just destroy them, I said, looking directly at him. We teach them what real power actually looks like. We let them see exactly who they just tried to throw away. I want to look Victor in the eyes when he realizes the truth. Good, my father said, closing the leather folder. That is a much better operational plan. My father stood up and picked up his encrypted satellite phone. He didn't make a massive move immediately. He is a master of psychological warfare in the financial markets. He called his primary wealth manager in Geneva and gave a very specific, very subtle set of instructions. He ordered the immediate, unannounced transfer of a fraction of his shares between his own holding companies. It wasn't enough to trigger an SEC investigation, but it was exactly enough volume to trip the internal security alarms at Hale Dominion's corporate headquarters. We were going to build a storm, and we were going to let the Hales feel the rain before the lightning struck. Meanwhile, back in Zurich, I knew exactly how Adrian's morning was playing out. He would have woken up in our massive, silent house. He would have seen that my bags were gone, and more importantly, he would have seen the €25 million contract sitting completely unsigned on his home office desk. He thought I would take the money out of desperation. My refusal to sign would be the first crack in his perfect reality, and then he would drive to his office. He would sit down at his desk, ready to handle a routine day of corporate law. But within hours, the rumors would start. Hale Dominion headquarters, the trading floor analytics team would pick up the anomaly. A massive, silent block of shares that hadn't moved a single inch in 2 decades, had suddenly shifted. It was a ghost waking up in their machine. The stock price would experience a very slight, unexplained dip. Just a fraction of a percent. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make a seasoned CEO like Victor Hale sweat. Adrian would start getting nervous. Victor would start demanding answers from his analysts, who would tell him that an unknown entity was moving pieces on the board. They wouldn't know who it was, and they wouldn't know what was coming next. The tension inside the Hale family was beginning to rise. They thought they had successfully eliminated a €25 million problem last night. They had no idea they had just woken up a $12 billion nightmare. I spent the rest of the day by the lake, chopping firewood with my father. The physical labor felt incredibly good. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't wearing a designer dress or sitting quietly in the corner of a room. I was breathing freezing air, swinging an axe, and preparing for a war I knew I was going to win. The storm did not hit all at once. It gathered quietly over the next 72 hours. Back in Zurich, Adrian was beginning to realize that his perfectly structured life was fracturing. He had expected me to call him, crying and begging for a compromise, or at the very least, he expected my lawyer to contact his team to negotiate the €25 million payout. Instead, he got absolute, deafening silence. I didn't block his number, but I didn't answer a single call. I let the phone ring out, knowing that every unanswered dial was driving him deeper into a state of nervous paranoia. But Adrian's domestic anxiety was absolutely nothing compared to the slow-burning panic currently sweeping through the executive floors of Hale Dominion. Rumors had officially started to circulate through the company. The market analytics team had flagged the sudden, unexplainable movement of massive blocks of foundational stock. These weren't regular shares traded by day traders. These were the silent, heavy blocks of equity that had held the company together for 20 years. They had shifted just a fraction of a percent, causing a slight but highly noticeable fluctuation in the stock price. To the outside world, it looked like a standard market hiccup. But to Victor Hale and the senior executive board, it looked like a sleeping leviathan waking up directly beneath their flagship. By Thursday morning, the tension had reached a boiling point. Victor was forced to call an emergency, closed-door session of the board of directors. The meeting was set at the Hale Dominion Global Headquarters in Frankfurt, Germany. It is a massive, intimidating skyscraper made entirely of cold steel and dark-tinted glass, designed specifically to make anyone standing at the bottom feel incredibly small. Adrian, as senior corporate counsel, was required to be there to help his father manage the legal fallout of whatever hostile takeover they assumed was brewing. They thought they were preparing to fight a faceless syndicate of aggressive Wall Street corporate raiders. They had absolutely no idea they were just waiting for my father. Magnus and I flew into Frankfurt on a quiet, private charter. My father had traded his faded flannel shirt and heavy work boots for a meticulously tailored, dark charcoal suit. Even in luxury clothing, he didn't look like a corporate executive. With his broad shoulders, trimmed gray beard, and calloused hands, he looked like a warlord who had simply agreed to wear a suit for the day. I walked beside him wearing a simple black blazer, a white blouse, and dark trousers. I wore absolutely zero jewelry, and I carried a single, slim leather folder. We walked straight through the massive revolving glass doors of the Hale Dominion headquarters. The cavernous lobby was heavily guarded by elite corporate security. As we approached the private executive elevators, two large men in dark suits immediately stepped in front of us, putting their hands up. "Excuse me, sir, this sector is strictly restricted to executive board members," the lead guard said, his voice firm and practiced. My father didn't slow down. He didn't even look at the guard. He simply reached into his inside pocket, pulled out a heavy, matte black keycard, and tapped it against the security scanner. The scanner didn't just beep. The entire security terminal lit up in solid green, flashing a clearance code that the guards had clearly never seen in their lives. The highest possible override. The guards froze, stepping back instantly, completely bewildered as the heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open for us. We rode up to the top floor in total silence. The elevator doors opened to a luxurious, quiet reception area. Beyond the reception desk were the massive, double oak doors of the primary boardroom. I could hear Victor Hale's voice echoing through the heavy wood. He was speaking quickly, aggressively trying to maintain control of a room that was rapidly losing faith in him. My father walked right past the stunned executive assistant, placed his heavy hands on the brass handles of the boardroom doors, and pushed them wide open. The scene inside was exactly what I had pictured. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany table. 15 of the most powerful corporate directors in Europe were seated around it, looking tense and exhausted. Victor was standing at the head of the table, pointing at a digital projection of the shifting stock metrics. Adrian was sitting near the front, flanked by massive stacks of legal binders, rubbing his temples in a state of visible distress. The heavy thud of the oak doors hitting the walls cut Victor off mid-sentence. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance. For a split second, there was total, dead silence. They saw a giant of a man step into the room, followed closely by the woman who was supposedly just erased from the Hale family completely. Victor Hale turned completely pale. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He recognized Magnus. Even though they hadn't stood in the same room in 2 decades, Victor knew exactly what the man who held the leash to his empire looked like. Adrian's reaction was entirely different. His jaw physically dropped. He looked at me, blinking rapidly as if his brain completely failed to process the image in front of him. He looked at my simple clothes, then he looked at the imposing man standing next to me, and I could practically see the gears in his head violently grinding to a halt as the horrific reality of the situation began to dawn on him. One of the senior board members, an older German man who had been with the company since its near collapse 20 years ago, suddenly stood up. He recognized Magnus too. Within seconds, the entire room of executives stood up in a wave of stunned, silent respect. Victor was the only one left standing at the front, looking like a captain watching his ship get torn completely in half. My father walked slowly toward the front of the room, his heavy footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floor. He didn't look at Adrian. He didn't look at the board. He walked straight up to Victor, stopping just 3 feet away from him. "Turn the projector off, Victor," my father said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a deep, terrifying authority that commanded the entire room. "You don't need to guess who is moving the market anymore." Victor swallowed hard, his hands actually trembling as he grabbed the remote and killed the screen. Magnus slowly turned to face the incredibly tense board of directors. For those of you who have forgotten history, or for those who are too new to know it, my name is Magnus Voss. I am the silent owner of the 3 holding entities that rescued this company from total bankruptcy 20 years ago. I am the largest single shareholder of this company. The room erupted into quiet, frantic whispers. The board members were looking at each other in absolute shock. I control exactly $12.4 billion of Hale Dominion stock, my father continued, his voice easily cutting through the noise. I own the walls of this building. I own the chairs you are sitting in. And for 2 decades, I have stayed entirely out of your way and let you play your little corporate games. I didn't care about your board seats or your public relations. Magnus slowly turned his head, his cold, piercing eyes locking dead onto Victor's pale face. Until last week, Magnus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy growl. Last week, your CEO sat at a dining table, slapped a non-disclosure agreement down, and tried to buy my daughter to make her disappear. You offered her 25 million euros. You tried to buy my blood for a price cheaper than 0.2% of the value of my shares. The collective gasp in the boardroom was incredibly loud. The board members instantly turned their heads to glare at Victor, their eyes filled with pure, unfiltered rage and total loss of faith. They instantly realized what had just happened. Victor Hale had just triggered a catastrophic, multi-billion-dollar corporate crisis over a petty, arrogant family vendetta. He had personally insulted the apex predator of their entire financial ecosystem because he thought she was a poor nobody. I looked over at Adrian. He was experiencing a complete psychological collapse. He was gripping the edges of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. He was hyperventilating slightly, staring at me with a look of absolute horror and profound realization. He finally understood why I never cared about his private jets or his luxury suites. He realized that the woman he spent 3 years trying to financially control could have bought and sold his entire legal firm with her pocket change. I stepped forward, breaking the silence. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I just looked directly into Adrian's terrified eyes, and then at Victor, who was physically leaning back against the wall for support. I told you I would remember that number, I said evenly. But you need to understand something right now. I never wanted your status. I never cared about your corporate empire. And I never needed your money. The silence in the Frankfurt boardroom was absolute. You could hear the faint, mechanical hum of the central air conditioning and the ragged, panicked breathing of the men who thought they ran the global energy market. I stood next to my father, looking at the 15 board members who were completely losing faith in their CEO. They weren't looking at Victor Hale with respect or admiration anymore. They were looking at him like he was a live, unpinned hand grenade that had just been dropped directly onto their polished mahogany table. In a matter of seconds, the entire power dynamic of the room had violently flipped. I didn't yell, and I didn't raise my voice to match the dramatic tension in the room. After years of dealing with artillery fire and chaotic military extractions, a room full of panicked men in expensive suits didn't intimidate me in the slightest. I just looked directly at Victor, who was physically trembling, and delivered the reality check he so desperately needed. I never needed your money, I told him, my voice perfectly level and calmed. Victor's mouth opened and closed, but no actual sound came out. He looked exactly like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire who had confidently slapped a 25 million euro contract down on a marble dining table just a week ago was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, rapidly aging man who was just realizing that his entire legacy, his entire fortune, and his entire identity were built on ground owned by someone else. The shift in power among the executives was instantaneous and brutal. Klaus, the oldest German board member who had initially stood up to acknowledge my father, turned his intense gaze entirely on Victor. Victor, Klaus said, his voice dripping with German precision and raw, unfiltered anger. Did you seriously jeopardize the foundational equity of Hale Dominion over a petty, personal domestic dispute? Victor tried to stammer out a coherent defense. He aggressively gestured with his hands, trying to say it was a massive misunderstanding, that it was simply a private family matter regarding a standard divorce settlement. But the board wasn't having it. They were furious, their faith in his leadership completely shattered by his reckless arrogance. They understood the brutal math. If my father decided to dump his $12.4 billion in shares out of spite, the stock would instantly collapse. The corporate debt would be called in by the global banks, the company would be delisted, and every single man sitting at that table would lose hundreds of millions of euros. Victor had risked their entire financial existence because he thought he was bullying a poor, defenseless ex-soldier. On the massive digital screen at the far end of the boardroom, a high-definition video conference grid showed the remote board members and key family stakeholders who had dialed into the emergency meeting. Eleanor Hale's face was frozen in the top right corner of the screen. For the first time since I had met her, the ruthless matriarch who controlled the family's public image with an iron grip was completely silent. She had heard every single word my father said. The woman who had constantly interrogated me about my lack of wealth, who had relentlessly dug into my background with private investigators, was staring through the camera lens in a state of absolute, paralyzing shock. Her carefully constructed, polite societal mask had entirely collapsed, and she completely lost control of the narrative she had spent years building. She didn't say a single word. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that she had been actively insulting and trying to erase the absolute apex of their financial food chain for 3 straight years. And then, there was Adrian. I slowly turned my attention to my husband. Adrian was experiencing a total psychological collapse right there in his leather chair. His perfectly tailored, bespoke suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He was gripping the edges of his thick legal binders like a drowning man holding onto a piece of driftwood, his chest heaving as the crushing weight of reality finally set in. He had spent 3 years systematically suffocating me. He had taken over my bank accounts, aggressively monitored my credit cards, and treated my basic desire for financial autonomy as a personal insult to his manhood. He genuinely believed he was rescuing a poor, uncultured woman from a hard life. He loved the intoxicating feeling of being my superior, the wealthy savior who dictated every aspect of my existence. Now, looking at me standing next to the man who controlled his entire universe, Adrian realized everything was a complete lie. He realized that every single time he bought me an expensive dress to make me look presentable for his high society friends, I could have bought the entire designer brand and shut down the factory. Every time he smugly paid a massive restaurant bill and told me not to worry about the cost, I was actively choosing to let him feel important. He hadn't trapped me because he was powerful. I had stayed in the marriage because I genuinely thought I loved him. And he had cowardly thrown that love away with a single nod at a dinner table. He slowly stood up. His legs were visibly shaking, barely able to support his weight. "Lena," he whispered, his voice cracking horribly. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak without that smooth, entitled corporate confidence. "Lena, I had no idea. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know, Adrian," I replied smoothly, crossing my arms over my chest. "Because you never actually bothered to look at me. You only looked at what you wanted me to be. You wanted a dependent. You wanted a shiny object that would nod and smile and be eternally grateful for the table scraps of your family's wealth." My father, who had been standing silently watching the wreckage of the Hale family's pride, finally stepped forward. He walked right past the stunned executives and approached the head of the table. He didn't ask Victor to move, he just stood there, towering over him, until Victor awkwardly and humiliatingly shuffled out of the CEO's chair, stepping back against the glass wall. "You owe my daughter an apology," my father said to Victor. His tone wasn't a request. It was an absolute, non-negotiable directive from a man who held the executioner's axe. Victor Hale, the titan of European energy, the man who routinely barked orders at prime ministers and global regulators, physically flinched. He looked desperately at the board members, hoping for some kind of intervention or support, but they all simply stared back at him with cold, unforgiving eyes. They wanted him to submit. They needed him to submit to save their own fortunes. Victor swallowed heavily, his immense pride visibly breaking in real time. He looked at me, his face a terrifying mix of red shame and pale fear. He had been forced into a corner with absolutely no way out. He started, his voice barely a dry whisper.
"Speak up, Victor," my father commanded, the deep timbre of his voice echoing off the glass walls. "The board needs to hear you."
Victor closed his eyes for a long, painful second. "I apologize," he forced out, the words practically choking him. "I misjudged the situation entirely. I apologize for the offer.
And for the extreme disrespect.
It was the most pathetic, forced apology I had ever witnessed, and it felt incredibly validating. It wasn't about the specific words he used, it was about the fundamental, irreversible shift in reality. The man who thought he could buy me like a piece of used equipment was now begging for my forgiveness just to keep his company afloat. I looked back at Adrian. He was still standing there, tears actually welling up in his eyes. The absolute destruction of his ego was hard to watch, but I felt zero sympathy. He had watched his parents mentally abuse me for years and did absolutely nothing.
He had nodded when they offered me money to disappear. "What happens now?"
Adrian asked, his voice completely broken, sounding like a lost child rather than a senior corporate lawyer.
"Now,"
I said, picking up the single slim leather folder I had brought with me, "you have to live with the truth." The massive digital screen at the far end of the Frankfurt boardroom displayed a high-definition grid of the remote stakeholders, but my eyes were locked entirely on the top right corner. Eleanor Hale, the ruthless matriarch who had spent the last 3 years meticulously controlling her family's public image with an iron grip, was staring through the camera lens in a state of absolute, paralyzing shock. For the first time in her entirely scripted, heavily curated life, she was completely silent. Having utterly lost control of the narrative, I walked slowly toward the center of the mahogany table, right into the direct line of sight of the conferencing camera. I wanted her to see me clearly. I wasn't wearing the expensive, restrictive designer dresses she used to force on me for her high society charity galas. I was wearing a simple blazer and trousers, exactly the kind of modest clothing she had constantly sneered at.
"Can you hear me, Eleanor?"
I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the massive, tense room. She didn't blink. She looked like a ghost trapped inside the monitor. This was the exact same woman who had constantly interrogated me over private family dinners, asking deeply invasive questions about my lack of assets and my former military income. This was the woman who had smugly sat across from me just a week ago, sipping sparkling water, and asking how a person like me could possibly step into her family without a hidden motive. She had hired elite private investigators to tear my life apart, actively searching for a grifter, a parasite, or a criminal. When they found absolutely nothing, her paranoia had convinced her that I was simply a master manipulator.
Now, looking at my father standing next to me, the man who literally owned the financial ground her entire social empire was built upon, her brain simply could not process the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake, and why father stepped up beside me, leaning slightly over the boardroom table to look directly into the camera lens. "Eleanor," Magnus said, his deep voice rumbling with a cold, terrifying authority.
"You spent 3 years trying to make my daughter feel like she was nothing. You treated her like dirt on your shoes because she didn't come from your shallow, pathetic world of inherited trust funds. You ordered background checks. You actively tried to erase her from your son's life with a €25 million bribe, acting as if you were doing her a generous favor." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, but she remained completely silent. The other remote board members on the video grid were watching her humiliation in real time. The socialite who thrived on being the most intimidating, untouchable presence in any room was being publicly dismantled in front of the exact people she desperately needed to impress. "You thought she was a vulnerability to your family's precious legacy," my father continued, narrowing his eyes. "But you are the vulnerability, Eleanor. Your sheer, staggering arrogance just cost your husband his reputation, and it very nearly cost this entire board their fortunes. I want you to remember this moment every single time you walk into your private country clubs or host your extravagant dinners. I want you to know that your entire luxurious existence is permitted solely because the woman you tried to throw away decided not to crush you." Eleanor slowly lowered her head, breaking eye contact with the camera. It was a microscopic movement, but to anyone who knew her, it was the ultimate gesture of total defeat.
She had been stripped of her power, her superiority, and her pride in a matter of minutes.
She was completely broken, and she hadn't even needed to say a single word. I turned my attention away from the screen and looked back at Adrian. He was still standing near his chair, his hands resting on the piles of useless legal binders he had brought to defend against a phantom corporate raider. He had just watched his father beg for forgiveness, and he had just watched his mother completely collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. The terrifying, omnipotent parents who had dictated his entire life were suddenly revealed to be nothing more than fragile, arrogant bullies who had picked a fight with a giant. Adrian looked at me, his eyes red and exhausted. The smooth, aggressive charisma of the senior corporate lawyer was completely gone. He looked like a man waking up from a 3-year-long coma.
"Lena," he said quietly, his voice devoid of any of its usual entitlement.
You never fought back. When my mother insulted you, when I controlled the accounts, when we pushed you into a corner, you never used this. You never threatened us with your father. Why? Because I wanted to see who you actually were, I told him honestly. I didn't want to use my father's leverage to force you to respect me. If I had to hold $12 billion over your head just to get you to treat me like a human being, then the marriage was already dead. I needed to see what you would do when you thought you held all the power. And I saw it. You chose to suffocate me, and then you chose to throw me away. Adrian closed his eyes, a tear finally escaping and running down his pale cheek. He understood. He finally realized that I had never needed their money. I had stayed out of genuine loyalty, and he had destroyed it piece by piece. He slowly opened his eyes and looked around the massive boardroom. He looked at the furious, panicked board members. He looked at his father, Victor, who was slumped silently against the glass wall. Then, he looked at his own perfectly tailored suit and the stacks of corporate contracts on the table. He looked at it all with a sudden, overwhelming sense of disgust. "I'm done," Adrian said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a strange new firmness that I hadn't heard in years. Victor's head snapped up. "Adrian, don't be a fool. We need to handle the legal fallout." "I said I am done, Dad," Adrian interrupted, his voice rising sharply, echoing across the room. It was the very first time I had ever seen him openly defy his father. "I am done fixing your messes. I am done pretending that this family is something to be proud of. We are toxic. We treat people like assets to be managed or liabilities to be erased. We tried to buy my wife out of my life, and I actually sat there and nodded like a coward." Adrian began aggressively shoving his legal binders and documents into his leather briefcase. He wasn't organizing them meticulously like he usually did. He was just blindly packing his things to get out of the room as fast as possible. "Adrian, you are a senior partner in this company," Victor warned, his voice shaking. "You cannot just walk out of an emergency board meeting." "Watch me," Adrian snapped back, snapping the brass locks of his briefcase shut. He looked directly at the 15 board members. "I officially resign as senior corporate counsel for Hale Dominion. I am leaving the company immediately." A fresh wave of shocked whispers ripped through the boardroom, but Adrian didn't care. He turned to me, his expression entirely shattered but possessing a tiny, fragile sliver of genuine honesty. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Lena," Adrian said, gripping the handle of his briefcase. "I don't deserve it. I let my family treat you terribly, and I did it too. I completely lost who I was. But I can't be this person anymore." He looked down at the floor, taking a deep, shaky breath before meeting my eyes again. "I'm going to leave Zurich. I'm going to find a way to actually help people instead of just protecting corporate wealth. I'm going to look for work at an organization that supports military veterans. It's the least I can do to start making up for how completely blind I was to the things you went through." I looked at him, absorbing his words. The decision to leave his family's multi-billion-dollar empire to work for a veteran support organization was a massive, unthinkable shift for a man like Adrian Hale. It was a desperate attempt to find the grounding and reality that he had spent his entire life actively avoiding. I didn't smile, and I didn't offer him comfort. I just gave him a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. Adrian turned around and walked out of the massive oak doors of the boardroom, leaving his father standing entirely alone in the wreckage of their family legacy. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, sealing the end of the life I had known for the last 3 years. The silence returned to the room, heavier and more absolute than before, as everyone waited to see what the true owners of Hale Dominion would do next. The heavy oak doors of the Frankfurt boardroom clicked shut behind Adrian, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in his wake. The 15 powerful corporate directors sitting around the mahogany table were completely paralyzed, their eyes darting nervously between my father, myself, and the broken, pale shell of Victor Hale leaning against the glass wall. They were waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. They fully expected my father to announce a massive liquidation of his $12.4 billion in shares, a move that would instantly trigger a catastrophic collapse of Hale Dominion's stock and wipe out their personal fortunes before the market closed. My father stood at the head of the table, his broad shoulders casting a long, intimidating shadow over the polished wood. He looked at the terrified board members, then down at Victor. He let them sweat in that agonizing uncertainty for a few more minutes, letting the sheer terror of their situation permanently imprint itself onto their minds. "I am not going to liquidate my holdings," my father finally announced, his deep voice breaking the unbearable tension. A collective, audible sigh of relief washed over the room, but my father immediately held up a massive, calloused hand, cutting them off before they could even think about celebrating. "Do not confuse my restraint with mercy. I am not sparing this company for your benefit. I am sparing it because there are tens of thousands of working-class employees, engineers, and field technicians whose families rely on the paychecks this corporation generates. I will not destroy their livelihoods just to punish your spectacular arrogance." He turned his cold, piercing gaze directly onto Victor. "You will remain the chief executive officer in name, Victor. But you will never make a unilateral financial decision for this company ever again. As of this exact moment, my holding companies are instating an independent oversight committee. Every merger, every acquisition, every executive bonus, and every structural change will require my direct, personal signature. You are no longer a king. You are a highly supervised employee, and you work entirely for me." Victor didn't argue. He didn't try to negotiate or save face. He simply gave a slow, defeated nod, completely stripped of the untouchable billionaire persona he had worn for decades. I looked up at the massive digital screen at the far end of the room. Eleanor's video feed was still active, but she had pushed her chair back into the shadows of her luxurious Zurich home office. She looked small, fragile, and utterly terrified. I realized in that moment that I did not choose revenge. Taking their money or legally destroying them would have been incredibly easy, but it would have made me exactly like them. Leaving them in this state of absolute psychological defeat, forcing them to wake up every single morning knowing that their extravagant lifestyle was a conditional gift permitted by the woman they tried to buy off, was a far more potent lesson. We left the Frankfurt headquarters exactly as we had arrived, quietly, without any fanfare, and completely in control. We didn't answer questions from the confused executive assistants, and the security guards practically tripped over themselves to open the doors for us as we walked out into the cool German air. Over the next 6 months, the dust slowly began to settle, and the reality of the new world order took root. The Hale family's public image remained somewhat intact, but behind closed doors, their absolute power was entirely broken. Eleanor stopped hosting her aggressively lavish charity galas, retreating into a quiet, heavily subdued social life. She could no longer look her wealthy friends in the eye, knowing that her entire status was built on a foundation of sand that I could wash away with a single phone call. Adrian, however, actually kept his word. I had expected his dramatic resignation in the boardroom to be a temporary flare-up of guilt, fully anticipating him to crawl back to his father's corporate empire within a few weeks when his bank accounts started drying up. But he didn't. He completely severed his financial ties to the Hale estate, packed his belongings, and moved out of our massive Zurich mansion into a tiny, remarkably average apartment on the outskirts of the city. He took a job working for a non-profit organization that provides legal and logistical support for military veterans. I didn't speak to him for those first 6 months. I needed the space to breathe, to completely decompress from the 3 years of psychological suffocation I had endured. I moved back to Brussels, renting a small, comfortable apartment that felt infinitely more like home than the sprawling Swiss estate ever did. Eventually, Adrian reached out. He didn't send a formal letter through a lawyer, and he didn't try to ambush me with grand romantic gestures. He sent a simple, brief text message asking if I would be willing to meet him for a coffee. I agreed, and I picked the location, a loud, completely unpretentious diner near the central train station, the exact kind of place he used to refuse to step foot in. When he walked into the diner, I almost didn't recognize him. The bespoke, impeccably tailored suits and the €2,000 watches were completely gone. He was wearing a slightly faded button-down shirt, a practical jacket, and a pair of worn-out boots. He looked physically exhausted, but his eyes were clearer than I had ever seen them. The smooth, entitled arrogance of the corporate lawyer had been entirely replaced by a quiet, grounded humility. He sat down across from me, ordering a simple black coffee. We talked for hours, and for the first time in our entire relationship, it felt like two equal human beings having a real conversation. He told me about his new job. He told me how incredibly difficult it was to navigate the bureaucratic nightmares that wounded veterans faced every day, and how utterly useless his previous corporate experience felt in the face of real, human suffering. He was finally learning what the real world actually looked like outside of his privileged bubble. He apologized to me again, not with grand, sweeping words, but with a quiet, genuine understanding of exactly how badly he had failed me as a partner. He acknowledged the controlling behavior, the financial manipulation, and his cowardly complicity in his family's cruelty. He didn't ask me to come back to him right then and there. He just wanted me to know that he was trying to tear down the man he used to be and build someone completely new. I looked at him across the sticky diner table, analyzing the profound shift in his character. I realized that the man I had married was dead, but the man sitting in front of me had a chance to become someone I could actually respect. I told him that I chose to keep our marriage open, but I set a strict, non-negotiable condition: absolute respect. There would be no more controlling my finances, no more dictating my choices, and absolutely no more treating me like a subordinate in my own life. If we were ever going to rebuild anything, it would be as absolute equals, starting completely from scratch. He nodded slowly, accepting the terms without a single ounce of hesitation. A few weeks later, I took a long weekend and drove back up into the freezing, pristine Austrian Alps to visit my father. The massive storm we had triggered in Frankfurt was firmly in the rearview mirror, and the world had settled back into a quiet rhythm. I pulled my truck into the gravel driveway and found my father sitting on the wooden porch of his cabin, a thick blanket over his knees, carefully whittling a piece of pine wood with his old pocket knife. I sat down next to him, handing him a fresh mug of steaming black coffee. We sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the freezing wind ripple across the surface of the alpine lake. I told him about my meeting with Adrian, about the small apartment, the veteran support job, and the strict boundaries I had set for any potential future we might have. My father listened quietly, his calloused hands steadily carving away the rough edges of the wood. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes tracking a bird circling high above the distant snow-capped peaks. He lowered his mug and looked at me, a warm, immensely proud smile forming beneath his gray beard. "You handled them perfectly, Lena," he said, his deep voice carrying over the sound of the wind in the pine trees. "You didn't let their arrogance change who you are. You showed them what true power actually looks like, and you walked away with your soul completely intact." He set his pocket knife down on the small wooden table next to his chair and leaned back, looking out over the vast, untouched wilderness that he valued far more than the billions of dollars sitting quietly in his offshore holding accounts. "Always remember what you saw in that boardroom," my father concluded quietly. "Money doesn't create a person. It only magnifies who they truly are."